What happens when a man who has spent his entire life debunking family legends discovers that some ghosts refuse to stay buried? Leo thought the Philadelphia experiment was just another conspiracy theory until he found his grandfather's hidden logbook. Inside, a confession that would shatter everything he believed about reality. The degaussing was a lie. The real experiment wasn't about invisibility. It was about weaponizing fear itself. And now, 80 years later, the weapon has found a new target. The air in the university archive was dead. Not in a morbid sense, but in a way only a preservationist could truly appreciate. It was stripped of humidity, cleansed of dust, and chilled to a constant, unyielding 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It was the perfect environment for history to sleep, undisturbed. And for Leo, it was the perfect environment to work. He wore thin, white cotton gloves, the kind that made you feel like you were handling a sacred relic, even if it was just a receipt from 1892. Today, it was a collection of letters from a Civil War infantryman, the paper so brittle it threatened to turn to dust with every careful turn. The silence of the room was a dense, heavy blanket, broken only by the whisper-soft rustle of ancient paper and the low hum of the climate control system. You see that new documentary that dropped? Leo didn't look up. The voice belonged to Kevin, a grad student half his age with twice his enthusiasm for modern nonsense. The one about the Philadelphia experiment. Man, it's wild. They've got this guy who swears his great-uncle was on the Eldridge, saw the whole thing. Green fog, men fused to the walls, the whole 9 yards. Leo allowed a small, weary smile to touch his lips. He carefully placed the letter he was examining back into its acid-free folder before finally looking over at the student. "Kevin," he said, his voice as dry as the air around them. "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and all they have are third-hand stories. Generational folklore passed down and embellished until the original memory, if there ever was one, is completely buried." He turned back to his work, the gesture a clear dismissal. People want to believe the world is more interesting than it is. Most of the time, it's just paperwork. He was a man who lived in a world of verifiable, tangible facts, a world of primary sources, of carbon-dated ink and authenticated watermarks. His family, particularly his grandfather's side, was a source of quiet shame, their name forever linked in the dark, crackpot corners of the internet to that very same absurd naval legend. Leo's life, his career, was a quiet, lifelong rebellion against that legacy of irrationality. Here, in the sterile silence of the archive, the ghosts of family folklore couldn't touch him. That evening, the ghost came home. It arrived in a cardboard box, sealed with yellowing tape, sitting squarely in the middle of his otherwise immaculate coffee table. His apartment was a reflection of his professional life. Orderly, minimalist, the books on his shelves arranged by subject and then alphabetically. History, material science, archival theory, no fiction. He sighed, the sound loud in the stillness of the room, the last effects of his recently deceased, estranged grandfather. He hadn't seen the man in over a decade, their relationship fractured by Leo's refusal to entertain the old man's stories. He finally cut the tape and opened the box. The contents were mundane. Old photographs of a man he barely recognized in a crisp navy uniform, a tarnished service medal, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a pipe, its bowl still holding the faint sweet scent of cherry tobacco. It was all so normal, so heartbreakingly human. It was the stuff of any life, not a legend, and then he saw it. At the very bottom of the box, nestled between a folded wool blanket, and a pair of worn leather boots was a book. It was a heavy engineer-esque logbook, bound in thick, dark leather, with no markings on the cover except for a small, faded navy anchor embossed in the lower right corner. He lifted it out. The leather was smooth but stiff with age, and it felt strangely, unnaturally cold to the touch, a deep, cellar-like cold that seemed to leach the warmth from his fingertips. An hour later, a glass of amber whiskey sat sweating on his desk as he idly opened the logbook. He wasn't expecting anything. If he was honest with himself, he was hoping to find final, definitive proof of the story's absurdity. Something to put the family ghost to rest for good. The first several pages were exactly what he'd predicted. The handwriting was a neat, disciplined cursive. The entries dry and technical. September 12th, 1943. Calibrating magneto-optical assemblies. Power fluctuations noted in quadrant 2. September 15th, 1943. Testing power relays for UG3 coil. Overload at 78. Rerouting auxiliary power. Leo let out a quiet scoff, a small, triumphant puff of air. He felt vindicated. It was the mundane paperwork of a naval engineer. He took a sip of his whiskey and read on, finding the project's official mission statement. He read the passage aloud to the empty room, as if presenting evidence. Project Rainbow's official objective is the successful application of electromagnetic fields to render a naval vessel undetectable to magnetically triggered torpedoes and mines. A degaussing project, nothing more. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a strange pang of pity. Pity for the conspiracy theorists, for the believers, for his own grandfather. They had taken this tedious, unglamorous engineering work and spun it into a fairy tale of teleportation and invisible men, all to make the world feel a little more interesting. He was about to close the book, to shelve it with the other relics of a life he barely knew, when his thumb brushed against the inside of the back cover. He felt it, a subtle indentation, a slight give where the leather should have been solid against the thick cardboard backing. It was almost imperceptible. His archivist-esque curiosity piqued. He grabbed a steel letter opener from his desk. He carefully worked the tip into the hairline seam and pried. The glue, brittle with age, cracked, and a section of the leather peeled away, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. Inside was a smaller, thinner booklet, its cover made of simple cardstock. He pulled it out. The paper was cheaper, the entries within written in a frantic, sloping hand that bore little resemblance to the neat script in the main log. This was not for official review. This was a secret. His heart began to beat a little faster. He turned to the first page and read the words that would irrevocably shatter the quiet, orderly world he had so carefully constructed. The degaussing is a fiction, a necessary lie for the log and the Navy. Oppenheimer splits the atom. We are tasked with fracturing the psyche. The goal is not invisibility. Leo leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat as he read the final scrawled line. It is psychogenic amplification. The instant his mind formed the two words, the desk lamp beside him flickered, not once, but 3 times, its filament glowing an angry orange. At the exact same moment, the surface of the whiskey in his glass, perfectly still just a second before, broke. It rippled violently, concentric circles expanding and collapsing as if from a sudden, silent, and impossible impact. Leo remained frozen, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the desk. The ripples in his whiskey slowly subsided, the surface once again a perfect, placid amber. The desk lamp hummed with a steady, normal light. It was over. It hadn't happened. It had to be a coincidence, A power surge in the old building, a city bus rumbling past on the street below, causing a tremor. There were 100 rational explanations, each one a thread he could use to stitch his reality back together. His mind, the precise, logical instrument he had honed over a lifetime, scrambled for purchase, for a foothold of reason in the face of the impossible. But the secret booklet lay open before him, its frantic scrawl mocking his denial. He forced his eyes back to the page, his heart hammering against his ribs. If there was a rational explanation, he would find it here, in the primary source. He had to understand the method behind the madness. His grandfather's writing grew more detailed, outlining the core of the project. He described a device he called the etheric resonator. The name sounded like something from a pulp science fiction novel, a piece of deliberate pseudoscience meant to mislead. But the principles behind it were described with chilling, scientific lucidity. It wasn't designed to bend light or manipulate magnetic fields. It was an antenna, but one tuned to the subtle, complex frequencies of the human brain. Specifically, it was calibrated to the electrical signature of fear. The concept is not to generate an energy field, his grandfather wrote, but to harness one that already exists. To capture the ambient psychogenic radiation of a contained group, in this case, a ship's crew, and amplify their collective anxiety. To weaponize panic. To turn a shared feeling into a tangible, offensive force. Leo felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't science. It was a perversion of it. A grotesque marriage of physics and psychology that belonged in a madman's diary. He read a key phrase aloud, his voice a strained whisper in the silent apartment. It turns the mind into a broadcaster. As the words left his lips, the air in the room changed. The ambient warmth was sucked away, replaced by a damp, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night outside. It was a deep cellar cold, the same unnatural cold he'd felt when he first lifted the logbook from the box. It clung to his skin, raising goosebumps on his arms. He was no longer just reading, he was participating. Sleep offered no escape. When Leo finally awoke, slumped over his desk with the morning light streaming through his window, it was to the same lingering chill and the residue of formless, anxious dreams. The book lay open, a silent accusation on his desk. He spent the day in a fugue state of obsessive research. His apartment, once a sanctuary of order, was now a frantic command center. He abandoned his meticulous methods for a desperate, hurried search for truth. He was back in his element, but the purpose had been inverted. He wasn't trying to debunk a myth, he was trying to verify an impossibility. His fingers flew across the keyboard of his laptop, cross-referencing the names of the sailors his grandfather had mentioned in the secret log with the official, declassified crew manifest of the USS Eldridge. The first sign of the cover-up was immediate. Of the dozen names from the log's preliminary trial group, 4 were completely absent from the official record. They were ghosts, men who had officially never set foot on that ship. He dug deeper. He found the other 8 names, but the data was wrong, subtly altered. 3 of them were listed as having been transferred to a naval hospital in Virginia 2 weeks before the date of the final experiment. Another 5 were listed as discharged, Section 8, a dismissal for reasons of mental instability, all dated October 29th, 1943, the day after the experiment. It was too neat, too clean. It was the work of an expert tidying up a mess, erasing people from history with the stroke of a pen. The official story wasn't just incomplete, it was a deliberately constructed lie, a fortress of paper built to hide a chasm of missing men. And Leo, the professional archivist, the man who knew better than anyone how to read the hidden stories in the margins of history, could see the lie for exactly what it was. Night fell again, and with it, an almost gravitational pull back to the logbook. The rational daytime world of digital archives and government records faded away, and the frantic scrawl of his grandfather's pen became his only reality. He read about the preliminary human trials. We exposed the first group to the resonator at only 5% of its potential capacity, the entry read. The physical effects were negligible. The psychological effects were instantaneous and terrifying. His grandfather wrote of the sailors reporting shared, vivid nightmares of drowning in an endless black ocean. He wrote of a sudden, explosive outbreak of paranoia, with bunkmates accusing each other of being foreign spies. And he wrote of one sailor, a young man from Ohio named Miller, who had to be forcibly sedated after clawing at his own eyes, screaming about the man in the static, a dark figure he claimed was standing in the corner of the testing chamber, watching them all. As Leo read the words, "the man in the static," he heard it, a faint sound from the darkest corner of his living room. It was a soft, whispering crackle, like a radio tuned to a dead channel. Shh, shh. He froze, straining his ears, telling himself it was the building settling, the refrigerator humming, his own overwrought imagination. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the page, but the feeling was undeniable. The unshakable, primal certainty that he was no longer alone. He was being watched. His hands were trembling now, but he couldn't stop. He had to know how it ended. He flipped through the remaining pages until he found the entry he was dreading. October 28th, 1943. The day of the final, full-scale experiment. The handwriting on this page was a barely legible scrawl, the ink smudged in places as if by a shaking, sweaty hand. "The resonator is active," his grandfather wrote. "Full power. The crew knows something is wrong. The fear is palpable. It's a taste in the air like burnt ozone and copper. It's starting. The fear cascade." Leo's eyes devoured the words, his heart pounding in time with the faint, rhythmic static from the corner of the room. The panic is no longer just a feeling. It has substance. It is visible now, shimmering in the air around the ship's mast. A heat haze of pure terror. As his brain processed the final words, he instinctively looked up from the book, his gaze drawn to the corner of his own room where the sound was originating. And he saw it. The air itself was warping. It shimmered and distorted in a column from floor to ceiling, like the heat rising from sun-scorched asphalt. It was faint, almost translucent, but it was there. It was real. A heat haze of pure terror, broadcasting live from a haunted shipyard 80 years in the past, right into the heart of his quiet, orderly apartment. It was not a memory he was reading. It was a haunting, and he was its audience of one. The world of verifiable facts ended in a shimmer. Leo scrambled backward, a choked gasp tearing from his throat. His legs tangled in his desk chair, sending it crashing to the floor with a clatter of plastic and metal that was absurdly, violently loud in the suddenly silent apartment. The academic detachment, the professional skepticism he had worn like armor his entire life, was gone shattered into a million pieces. In its place was a raw primal fear that left him breathless. He was no longer a historian examining a curious artifact. He was a victim, trapped in a room with a ghost that had just crawled out of the pages of a book. His eyes were locked on the shimmering distortion in the corner, a wound in the very fabric of reality. He crab walked away from it, his back hitting the solid comfort of the opposite wall. His mind, a library of carefully catalogued facts, was now a storm of pure terror, the teleportation story, the green fog, The fused sailors, he'd dismissed it all as childish fantasy. Now he understood. The truth wasn't that the story was fake. The truth was that the story was a mercy. It was a comfortable, digestible myth created to hide a reality so monstrous, so fundamentally wrong, that it couldn't be allowed to see the light of day. He looked at the logbook, now lying open on the floor where he de-dropped it. It was no longer a historical document. It was a weapon-S manual, and the weapon was aimed directly at him. With his gaze darting nervously toward the corner where the air still warped and buckled, he lunged for the book. His hands shook so badly he could barely focus on the frantic script. He had to know what happened next. Survival depended on it. His grandfather's handwriting grew even more chaotic, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate rush to bear witness. He wrote of the immediate aftermath. The USS Eldridge didn't vanish and reappear in Norfolk, hundreds of miles away. That was the lie they told the papers. The ship had flickered out of existence for only a few minutes, and when it returned, it was right back in its berth at the Philadelphia Naval shipyard, wreathed in a faint, sickly ozone haze. And then came the horror. It was a butcher's yard, Leo read, his own voice a choked whisper. Some of the men, they were simply gone, vanished. Others were fused into the steel of the bulkheads and the deck. I saw a man, his face and torso seamlessly embedded in a wall, his eyes open and screaming without a sound. He was alive. God help us! He was alive! The entry went on, a litany of grotesqueries. Sailors were found wandering the deck, their minds wiped clean, their faces frozen in masks of silent, unending terror. 2 others were found incinerated, reduced to piles of fine carbon dust, as if they had been exposed to an impossible heat. This was the origin of the legends, the gruesome reality that had been sanitized into a spooky ghost story for public consumption. This was the cost of fracturing the psyche. Leo's stomach heaved. He could feel the phantom scent of ozone and burnt wiring in his own apartment. The shimmering in the corner seemed to pulse in time with his racing heartbeat. He forced himself to read the next entry, the final confession. The scientists who had overseen the project were in a panic. The reading showed that the resonator, even after the ship had reappeared, was not shutting down. In fact, its output was growing exponentially. The feedback loop from the crew's initial terror was self-sustaining, and the psychogenic field was expanding. Their projections showed it would envelop the entire eastern seaboard within an hour. They had created a psychic atom bomb, and it was about to detonate. That was when his grandfather acted. While the physicists and engineers screamed at each other, paralyzed by the scale of their failure, he had grabbed a fire axe from a wall mount. He wrote of running through the ship's engine room, the air thick with the hum of the resonator. He described swinging the axe with all his might, again and again, smashing the primary power conduit that fed the device. The overload was catastrophic, the entry read, the ink smeared by a trembling hand. But it worked. The feedback loop collapsed inward. The field was contained to the ship, but I didn't stop it. I only changed its nature. I severed it from its power source, forcing it to feed on the only thing left. The psychic residue of the event itself, the echoes of the terror, the screams of the dying. A single, terrible line stood alone at the bottom of the page, a confession and a curse. I saved the world, but I murdered those men. I turned their tomb into an engine. Leo finally understood. The shimmering distortion in his room wasn't a broadcast from the past. It was the exhaust from that engine. A perpetual motion machine powered by death and fear, and the logbook was its conduit, its anchor to the here and now. And as this terrible knowledge flooded his mind, his own fear spiked. a fresh wave of adrenaline and horror. He was a part of the engine now. His terror was fuel. He watched, paralyzed, as the shimmering haze in the corner responded to his panic. It fed on it. The vague, watery distortion began to tighten, to coalesce. It drew inward, condensing from a formless mist into a distinct, man-shaped silhouette composed of roiling, dark static. A low bass hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. The figure was featureless, a hole in the world in the shape of a man, but its form was unmistakable. It had a head, a torso, arms, and legs. It was a statue sculpted from television snow and shadow, and as Leo stared, his heart threatening to burst from his chest, the thing slowly turned its head, its blank, featureless face moving to look directly at him. The thing made of static and shadow turned its head. There was no neck, no muscle, just a slow, impossible pivot of a form that should not have had substance. And Leo, a man who had dedicated his life to the certainties of the material world, felt the last of his sanity begin to fray. He was trapped in a psychological cage. The fear echo, as his mind now named it, didn't move toward him. It didn't have to. It simply existed in the room, a silent black hole sucking all reason and courage out of the air. Its presence was a direct assault on his senses. The whispering static that had started in the corner now seemed to come from inside his own head. A chorus of sibilant, meaningless voices. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image of the thing was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. When he opened them again, the apartment was starting to unravel. In his peripheral vision, the hard lines of his bookshelves seemed to soften and warp, the wood grain flowing like slow-motion water. The ceiling looked lower, the walls closing in, the paint seeming to sweat and melt under the oppressive weight of the entity's presence. He had to get out. The thought was a primal scream in his mind. He pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. The front door was only 20 feet away, an impossible journey. He tried to run, to force his body into motion, but his legs were leaden, refusing to obey. It was a classic nightmare paralysis, a physical manifestation of his own crippling terror. The echo wasn't holding him there with some invisible force. It didn't need to. It was using his own fear as a shackle. He was a prisoner of his own emotions, hunted by the very thing his grandfather had sought to weaponize. He collapsed back to the floor, a sob of helpless frustration caught in his throat. Huddled behind his couch, which now felt like the last solid object in a dissolving world, his hand found the logbook. It was the source of this nightmare, but it was also the only thing that held any answers. His methodical archival skills were a distant memory. He was no longer a scholar. He was a cornered animal. He flipped through the last pages of the secret booklet, his desperate fingers fumbling, ripping a thin page in his haste. He didn't care. He was searching for a weapon, a weakness, a shutdown sequence, anything. He found it on the very last page, in a section of his grandfather S notes, labeled simply, Theories. The writing was shaky, but the thought process was clear, a final flare of scientific lucidity in the face of unspeakable horror. The resonator amplifies shared panic, his grandfather wrote. It creates a psychic feedback loop. The loop is the key. The engine cannot run without it. It must be broken. Leo S. eyes scanned the page frantically. Conventional power will not work. It would be like trying to douse a fire with gasoline. The loop must be disrupted not with more energy, but with its opposite, with signal purity, with a conscious, focused imposition of order on its chaos, a psychogenic ground. A psychogenic ground. The phrase was meaningless pseudo-science, the kind of term he would have scoffed at just 2 days ago. But now, It was his only hope. It wasn't an engineering solution he could build. It was a psychological defense he would have to find within himself. As this sliver of desperate hope entered his mind, so too did a fresh wave of terror at the impossibility of it. How could one man will stand against a force born from the collective dying screams of 100 sailors? His fear surged again, a fresh offering to the entity in his living room, and the entity fed upon it. Fueled by Leo's terror, the echo solidified. The roiling static that composed its body grew denser, the blacks deeper, the whites sharper. The low hum in the room intensified, vibrating through the floor, through the couch, into Leo's very bones. The static on its face began to clear, like a television screen tuning into a signal, and a face appeared. It was the face of a young man, no older than 20, his features contorted in a mask of pure, undiluted terror. His eyes were wide with a horror Leo could not comprehend, his mouth open in a permanent, silent scream. It was the face of the sailor from the logbook, the boy from Ohio who had clawed at his own eyes. It was Miller. The echo, now wearing this tortured face, took a single slow step forward. It raised a shimmering, static-wreathed hand and reached for Leo. This was it. The end. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the killing blow, for the touch that would annihilate him. The touch came. A brush of shimmering fingers against his cheek. It wasn't violent. It wasn't crushing. It was a jolt of ice and electricity, a feeling of profound, soul-deep cold. And with it came a psychic torrent. His mind was flooded with a flash of deafening noise, the shriek of twisting metal, the roar of an overload, the thunder of explosions, and beneath it all, the collective screams of hundreds of dying men. It was a tidal wave of sensory horror, the last moment of the USS Eldridge, downloaded directly into his brain. And in that flash of shared agony, Leo understood the hand wasn't reaching out to harm him. The scream wasn't a threat. This thing, this fear echo, was not a monster. It was a victim. It was the ghost of a terrified young man, trapped in an eternal loop of his own death, reaching out not in aggression, but in a desperate, unending plea for help. The psychic storm receded, leaving Leo on the floor, gasping for breath. The phantom shriek of twisting metal and the screams of dying men faded, but the image of the sailor's face, a mask of pure terror, remained. The echo stood before him, its hand still outstretched, its silent scream still tearing through the fabric of the room. But everything had changed. The fear that had paralyzed Leo was gone, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking empathy. He wasn't looking at a monster. He was looking at the ghost of a scared kid who had died a terrible death, his final moment of agony stretched into an eternity. Slowly, shakily, Leo got to his feet. He forced himself to stop recoiling, to stand his ground. His gaze fell upon the original logbook, the one filled with neat, orderly science, not the frantic confessions of the secret booklet. He picked it up, its familiar weight a strange comfort in his trembling hands, a psychogenic ground, an imposition of order on chaos. He knew what he had to do. He held the book open, its pages filled with the clean language of engineering, a language he understood better than any other. He made eye contact with the screaming face of the echo, and instead of feeding it more of his fear, he began to speak. His voice was low and steady, a deliberate, rhythmic anchor in the swirling chaos. He didn't pray. He didn't plead. He performed an exorcism with the only scripture he had ever truly believed in. Primary coil assembly, he began, his voice gaining strength with each word. Copper wound, operating at 1.2 Tesla. Coolant system, closed loop, distilled water. He was reading the technical specifications from the early sane pages of the log. He was fighting a ghost with verifiable facts. He was pushing back against a tide of supernatural terror with the calm, irrefutable order of science. Magneto-optical assemblies calibrated to a variance of 0.001%. Power relays for UG3 coil. Nominal voltage, 750 kilovolts. Failsafe protocols engaged via pressure-sensitive release valve. As Leo continued his rhythmic, monotonous reading, the fear echo began to react. It let out a shriek, not of aggression, but of pain, a tearing, abrasive sound of pure static. The calm, logical signal of Leo's voice was poison to its fear-based existence. Its form, once solidifying, now flickered violently, the face of the young sailor distorting and fading like a bad television signal. The oppressive cold in the room began to recede, chased away by the steady cadence of Leo's voice. He didn't falter. He turned the page and continued, his words a relentless wave of logic washing over the creature of chaos. Structural integrity of the primary conduit, hardened steel, 10-inch diameter. Maximum operational temperature, 800 degrees Celsius. Core frequency regulated by a quartz crystal oscillator. The echo convulsed. Its man-shaped form dissolved back into a shimmering heat haze, writhing in agony. It was losing its cohesion, its very existence destabilized by the imposition of rational, boring, beautiful order. Leo took a deep breath and delivered the final, desperate line from the page, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't known he possessed. System diagnostics initiated via terminal command, run sequence Alpha Gamma 0. With that last, definitive piece of technical jargon, the shimmering haze imploded. It collapsed in on itself with a soft whoomp, dissolving not into darkness, but into a brief, brilliant shower of harmless fading sparks. They danced in the air for a moment like fireflies, and then vanished. And then, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was only silence. Months later, the man who stood in the sterile high-tech vault of the Atwood Institute for Anomalous History was not the same one who had opened his grandfather's box. Leo looked older, his face etched with a quiet gravity, but his eyes were calm. The frantic terror was gone, replaced by a profound, settled understanding. He held the leather-bound logbook one last time before placing it into the gloved hands of a serious-looking female archivist. Her name was Dr. Alani Finch, and her institution specialized in exactly this, things that did not fit. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice soft. "An artifact this active, it's dangerous." Leo nodded, his gaze fixed on the book. "It's not a hoax," he said, his voice even. "And it's not a ghost story. It's a data set we don't understand yet. Its operating system is fear, and its hardware is a tragedy. Don't try to debunk it. Don't try to replicate it. Just keep it safe." Dr. Finch looked from Leo to the book, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She carefully placed the logbook into a small, airtight, climate-controlled container. An automated arm took the container and slid it into an empty slot in a vast, floor-to-ceiling wall of identical containers, a library of sleeping monsters. As the vault door hissed shut, locking the book away, Leo knew he had finally found the synthesis he'd been searching for. Some phenomena couldn't be explained away by science, but they didn't have to be surrendered to superstition. They could simply be acknowledged, respected for their power, and contained with rigorous discipline, waiting for a day when science was finally ready to understand. What makes a good ghost story? Is it the spooky details, or is it the grain of truth that might be buried underneath? The story of Leo and his grandfather's logbook starts with that exact conflict. Leo is a man of pure reason, someone who believes that every mystery can be solved with enough paperwork. For him, the legend of the Philadelphia experiment is just folklore, a silly story people tell to make the world more interesting. But what happens when the evidence he uncovers points not to a simple, rational explanation, but to a truth that is both scientific and terrifyingly supernatural? What's fascinating about Leo's journey is that he doesn't just abandon his skepticism and become a believer. Instead, he is forced to synthesize the two. The ghost he confronts is real, but it's the product of a scientific experiment gone wrong. And how does he defeat it? Not with prayer or a magic ritual, but with the tools he knows best. He reads technical specifications at it. He performs a scientific exorcism, using order and logic to dismantle a creature born from chaos and fear. In the end, he doesn't destroy the haunted logbook or preach about the supernatural. He treats it like a dangerous data set that we just don't understand yet, something to be contained with discipline. It makes you wonder about the line between our world and the unexplained. So, here's my question for you. When faced with something that truly defies explanation, is it more rational to dismiss it or to find a new way to understand it?